Good evening, my friends. This is Paul, and this may seem like sort of an out-of-left-field type of review, but today I wanted to review Professor Layton and the Miracle Mask for the 3DS, partially because it was the first Layton game I ever beat, not counting Professor Layton versus Phoenix Wright, and also that I actually had a sudden realization of some profound Catholic teachings that could come out of that game. So this is sort of going to complement the Catholic review that I'm planning on doing right after this video. So if you haven't played a Layton game yet, I would recommend that you check out my Unwound Future video to get the gist of it. This game is basically the same as that, except that because this was the first Layton game on the 3DS, they took advantage of the extra power that the 3DS has over the DS to provide more detailed environments. The character sprites actually moved and breathed. Stereoscopic 3D was of course a big deal, and the interface for how you interacted with the areas outside of the puzzles was also modified. In previous Layton games, you'd have to practically break your screen open, tapping every nook and cranny, trying to find the hint coins. But in Miracle Mask, you move the magnifying glass with the circle pad, and what you see is displayed on the top screen. And especially if you have stereoscopic 3D on, the sense of depth is amazing. Like, you really feel like you're reaching into the far bits of the town. And then you just simply see if there's an orange glow on your magnifying glass. And if there is, it's likely that there's either a hint coin or a hidden puzzle or a character to talk to. The puzzles themselves probably aren't going to shop better in Layton comers. Personally, I found them to be relatively hard, but not so hard to the fact where it made the game broken, except for two specific instances that I can think of. The first one might just be me, maybe I'm just terrible at those kind of puzzles, but I did find one that used tilt controls, and I felt like that was totally unnecessary, and the puzzle probably could have easily been solved if you at least had the option to use the circle pad, as Professor Layton versus Phoenix Wright had quite a few puzzles that used standard controls to replace 3DS type controls, so why couldn't this one? Aside from that, the puzzles range from logic puzzles to environmental reasoning to basically anything that involves the old gray matter. And just in case the puzzles are too hard for you, there's always hint coins. Now, there aren't unlimited hint coins, so you have to carefully preserve them to make sure that you have enough to get by. Now, one of the things that always frustrated me about Layton games were the requirements they had, and often very stingent requirements, on solving a certain number of puzzles before you can get to a certain part of the game. And oftentimes it was for the stupidest reasons. Like, you'd be on the chase, trying to chase this bad guy, and this cop would stop you, and he'd say, "I'm sorry, but I cannot allow you to pursue this villain until you have solved at least 80 puzzles." And that's what plagues the entire gameplay, is you could just be minding your own business, and they'll make some offhanded comment that makes no sense, like, "Oh, your face reminds me of a puzzle." Well, that particular example, Layton's assistant said that they didn't have time for it, but silly stuff like that will trigger a puzzle out of nowhere. Thankfully, the puzzles themselves are really good. They're just not very good when it comes to context. It's mostly just to make sure that the storyline doesn't get too dull, which, unfortunately, this game suffers with having a very slow start. It's not until probably the halfway point that the game even gets anywhere with, like, plot progression and character development. And even then, the game switches between the past life of Herschel Layton and the current life when he's Professor Layton. And even though I loved the switch of perspectives, I didn't like how thinly spread out they were. Because unlike Unwound Future, where you had two versions of London to explore, or Diabolical Box, which had a bunch of towns, you're stuck in one little city of Monte d'Or, and boy does that background music get super annoying, and the plot just takes forever to advance. Thankfully, seeing as this was the first Layton game that I beat, I enjoyed the way that the plot played out. I enjoyed the twist at the end, and there were even a few emotional moments that I really liked. I've heard from longtime Layton fans that it's really easy to guess the plot, but me being my first time, I did not until very late into the game, and so I was pleasantly surprised by how they handled the ending. What I was really surprised at was how they handled the section of the game where it briefly transforms into a top-down dungeon crawler. I won't spoil why that happens, but basically it's a nice change on the whole solve a puzzle, play the occasional minigame, search for hint coins, rinse and repeat deal that permeates the entire Layton experience. Granted, they're not particularly engaging. The puzzles aren't nearly as hard as those in the Zelda series, and the enemy encounters are nothing to brag about either, but they at least break up the monotony a good amount, and some of them really do involve a good amount of environmental reasoning, which, you know, I love those kind of puzzles. Zelda fans should find a lot to be happy about here. Now, if you're coming off this game just after you've played The Last Spectre for DS, you'll be disappointed to know that there's no Layton's London Life mode, and the minigames are nothing special. But to make up for it, the audio in this game is simply superb. The voice acting, for the most part, is phenomenal, especially Layton. Like, I love his gentlemanly nature, and Christopher Miller is actually American, which makes it even more impressive. And the soundtrack, while yes, it may get repetitive at times, the audio is unmistakably very high quality, putting this series into fully orchestrated instruments for the first time ever. Now, there were occasional live pieces in the previous DS games, but this game just goes all out. Like, even if you don't like the tracks themselves, you at least have to admit that the instrumental quality is stellar. Also, depending on how good you do in the puzzles and how many times you fail/win, you can also earn extra features like the soundtrack, voice clips, and even a little Easter egg that you can put into Last Spectre to earn even further backstory into that game. So overall, I would say that Miracle Mask is a decent game for those looking for a nice puzzler with a pleasantly interesting story and as lovable of a main character as Herschel Layton and his gentlemanliness, or his stuck-up rudeness in the past, and seeing the contrast into how he radically transformed his personality. And if you're a Layton newcomer, you might be a little bit disappointed that this doesn't have nearly as much emotional oomph and closure as Unwound Future, but it is a nice segue into the next Layton game, which I've also beaten, so I'll get to reviewing that in the meantime. And regardless of who you are, you should really enjoy the fantastic music, spectacular voice acting, and 135 or however many days there are in a year, free puzzles that only take up like a block on your 3DS. So if you don't have enough puzzle action, there's plenty to go around. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and until the next time I'm able to make a video, keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless.